tonight. My name is Sadie Urban. I'm the events coordinator here at the Reserve. This talk is part of a year-long lecture series called the Nuzum Lecture Series. It's funded in part by the Kickapoo Reforestation Fund, also known as the Nuzum Grant, and also the Friends of the KBR help out with the refreshments as well. Tonight we have Scott Walter. He's a wildlife biologist with the Regional Ruffed Grouse Society and the American Woodcock Society, here to talk to us about wildlife habitat with an emphasis on grouse. So I'd appreciate, I'm going to pass this around, I'd appreciate if you could sign in. I need to keep track of attendance for grant purposes. And I'll hand it over to Scott. Thank you.
Thank you, Sadie. Welcome. Good group tonight. I was thinking on the drive up, this is, I don't know, the fourth or fifth talk I've given here at the Reserve. The first couple were when I was teaching down at UW-Richland. I was on the faculty down there for 10 or 11 years. Then I switched to the DNR and worked in the Wildlife Bureau for about 5 years. Gave a couple talks, and now I'm here as an employee of the Ruffed Grouse Society to talk about something near and dear to my heart, and that's healthy forests and how we achieve them. So the moral of the story there is I can't hold a job, I guess. But I've been in my new role for, what, 4 or 5 months now. I came on midsummer, and I've spent a lot of time traveling around Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa. That's the region I cover, talking with folks, not just about ruffed grouse. Sometimes you work for the Ruffed Grouse Society. People tend to think that all you care about are ruffed grouse, but really what the mission of this organization is to promote healthy forests via active forest management, which is something I believe in with all my heart. I have seen on my family's farm down near Viola, which I'm lucky enough to live on with my wife and kids now. I've seen changes in the structures, changes in the species composition of that forest, and I've also seen the resultant impacts on the wildlife community, including a steep decline in our local ruffed grouse population. Anybody in here remember the heyday of grouse in the Driftless Area? 50 flush days, birds drumming from every ridgetop in the spring. There's a reason that we don't experience that anymore, and it doesn't have to do with predators directly, and it doesn't have to do with turkeys. It's all habitat mediated, so we'll talk about some of that. But I thought I had a little quiz before we got into the meat of the talk. How many of you, if you could choose your preferred habitat, might choose a habitat like this?
No.
No? I thought everybody, all right, sorry.
Wrong crowd.
This is the wrong crowd. Absolutely not.
Wait, no, here, I could have moved there.
I heard somewhere that something like 7 million people go through this place a year. Apparently not a one of you. Okay. Well, how about this?
The wrong part of town.
And if you were to visit for a cultural event, how many of you might like to spend a little bit of time in a setting like this? My point, however pathetically made there, was that we all have different environments we like to spend time in, right? And when it comes to forest wildlife, it's exactly the same story. I assume we're all here familiar with what's called secondary succession or succession. The simple idea that following a disturbance, there's this natural progression and change in the vegetation community from an open grassy landscape to a brushy landscape to a landscape dominated by large trees. And as we move through that succession, we see changes, of course, in the structure, the vertical and horizontal structure in that vegetational community. We also see, of course, dramatic changes in the species that live on that site. Shrubs, trees, early successional trees like Aspen, initially oaks, and then in this area largely climax maple basswood forest. It's a natural process, and on any undisturbed land it takes place. And as long as you're in an area that's moist enough, you'll eventually end up with what's called a climax forest. It might be of many different types, depending on where you are, what site you're on, etc. But around here, it tends to be a maple basswood forest that our forests move to, at least on the moister sites. So this is natural. Things progressing in this direction in the absence of disturbance, and that's an important point. But when it comes to the wildlife that lives in this landscape, the wildlife community changes as well, right? Birds like ruffed grouse, indigo buntings, chestnut-sided warblers, eastern towhees, they like young forests, regenerating forests, early successional forests, right? And as that forest matures, you'll lose those species and gain others. Things like cerulean warblers, pileated woodpeckers, things that are more suited, better adapted for older forest conditions, okay? It's an important point because when we talk about healthy forests, what does healthy mean? In my mind, healthy means diverse, right? A functioning ecosystem that includes all of the component parts, all the cogs, as Elder Leopold referred to them. How do we maintain that diversity, given that nature wants to push constantly in this direction? Well, the answer is we'll see, is that system needs to be disturbed, okay? So disturbance, and when I talk about disturbance, what am I talking about nowadays largely?
Logging.
Chainsaws, logging, right? Historically, of course, many forms of disturbance contributed to the diversity in our plant communities. Fire being a big one, a big modifying influence, wind throw, disease, etc. But nowadays, we rely on logging to do something that's important ecologically, and that is recreate these earlier successional communities so that we can support the full spectrum of wildlife species that might be found in that landscape, okay? So disturbance is important. So when you look at our beautiful driftless region here that we're all so attached to, it's beautiful, right? And when we drive up and down the road, you're tempted to look at these hills and think, oh, what a beautiful, natural, healthy landscape. And to some extent, of course, you're true. That's very true. You're exactly correct. But when you start digging into long-term changes that have taken place in our forest, we've sacrificed some of that diversity because of a lack of appropriate disturbance. And we'll talk about that. Aren't we lucky?
Yes.
Living where we live?
Yes.
I thank my lucky stars every day. Okay. So, when we look at the wildlife community, we saw that individual wildlife species are associated with specific portions of that successional continuum. Of course, we've got grassland birds on one end, we've got birds that are associated with climax, mature forests on the other end. But what we've seen around here, when it comes to what we might consider the canary in the coal mine for young forests, brushy areas, the ruffed grouse, this is the red line here tells us what's happened with our local ruffed grouse populations over about the last 3 decades. 1980 is when 12-year-old Scott Walter, I've just dated myself, 12-year-old Scott Walter bought his first hunting license and started chasing ruffed grouse around the hills on our farm. Lots of grouse. Nowadays, you see a grouse. It's something you mentioned to your buddies at the gas station over coffee, right? Population stabilized at about 10% of what it was 3 decades ago. The white line, the same type surveys, ruffed grouse surveys from northern Wisconsin. You see in northern Wisconsin, the peaks continue, right? More of a cyclic population dynamic up there, but still relatively abundant during peak years. We had so many grouse. Anybody go up north grouse hunting in the fall? Northern Wisconsin attracts folks from all over the country because there are more grouse in northern Wisconsin than virtually anywhere else. We had more right there, right outside that window 30 years ago than we did and do in northern Wisconsin during peak years. Incredibly abundant. So what happened? Well, we'll get to that, but Did I skip a slide there? Or did I cut that out? No. So I threw a couple slides in here that summarizes some research I did way back when I was teaching down at UW-Richland. What happened with grouse? Why have we seen this 30-year slide in numbers? The forest has gotten older, we'll talk about that, but when we went out into the field and put little transmitters, isn't that cute? Little grouse wearing a necklace. Put transmitters on grouse and followed them around. It allowed us to look at habitat use, habitat selection, determine what habitats were important for the grouse, but it also allowed us to estimate survival. And what we found was a big difference between males and females. So when we think about the whole population declining, we wanted to dig into that in a little more detail. About 43% of the males, if they were alive one New Year's Eve, would be alive the next New Year's Eve, 1 year to the next. But when we looked at that, our data set for females, only about 16% would survive from 1 year to the next. That was interesting. And actually for a grouse, about 43% survival is not bad. That's right on par with what you see in the literature. When you think about it, that's a piece of meatloaf with wings, right? Anything that can eat it's going to eat it at some point. So 43% isn't bad, but of course 16% is abysmally low.
How does that compare to pheasants?
Pheasants, about 50% is sort of a typical survival rate for upland game birds. So 43% in the ballpark, but 16%, not a good thing. So we started to dig into our data, our radio telemetry data in a little greater detail. And what we found is a big difference in the way these birds were moving across the landscape. These green dots here are the locations for an individual male grouse throughout the late fall and winter period. And you see he didn't move. This was down by Gotham, and he was hanging out in a really nasty thicket. It was an old decadent aspen stand that was nothing but buckthorn and honeysuckle in the understory. A couple exotic shrub species, but very dense. He was in there, he was safe, survived the winter, hopped up on a log in the spring and started drumming. But when we looked at females and the way they were moving this time of year, this is the same landscape. Here's a female that spent much of the early winter in the same area as that male, survived well. But when we got into March and April, that female, and this was typical of all the females that we had radio equipped, started to bounce all over the landscape. One day she'd be in this valley, the next day she'd be over the ridge, next day a mile down the road, the next day she'd be back. We started to wonder why. Of course, what she's doing, she's looking for two things: drumming males and nest sites, okay? And that's propelling her across the landscape. When we summarize this, I don't want to go into a lot of detail with regards to that research, but I think it's instructive in terms of the changes, as we'll see, that have taken place in our forested communities and what they mean for the wildlife that use them. If you look at this time period, March, April, May into June, the time period that I showed you these females were moving, they were moving far greater distances than were the males. So the red bars are the females, the stippled white bars, the males. And if you remember that survival slide, that's exactly the time of year that female survival tanked. So the poor survival in the spring seemed to be tied into these much greater movements. Why is that a problem? Do they just get tired out? As we'll see, the landscape, the young forest habitat that exists nowadays isn't conducive to allowing birds to travel across the landscape like that. So what happened? Well, essentially, the history of the whole driftless area can be written parallel with the history of agriculture. Who's this handsome gentleman?
Your grandpa?
My great-great-grandfather. This is my grandma's house still sits right about here. The old barn that I used to play basketball in as a kid, down there by the road. This is the valley. But if you look at the firewood there, these folks had a big impact on the hills. This area was a climax maple basswood forest prior to settlement. Old Austin Jacob Walter and all his neighbors moved into the area, started to farm. They started to take logs off the hills for firewood, for building material. If the land was flat enough, that they could crop it, they tilled it, they planted corn, they planted hay, etc. And if it wasn't, what did they do? Fenced it off and grazed it with their livestock. So all the hills essentially in the driftless area were at one time pastured. Okay? And to manage that pasture, what my grandfather and his father and his father and his father did, every spring you got a bucket full of oily rags, you lit them on fire and you walked along the bottom of the hill. Burned off that hillside pasture to stimulate better browse for the cattle. So that maple basswood forest was converted in a few short decades into a woods dominated more by oak and hickory. So that's largely where our oak and hickory forests in this area came from. So a heavy hand by man on our forests at this time. But of course what happened in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, could you make a living milking 8 cows? Planting a half-acre of tobacco like my ancestors did? No. These small farms, a lot of them were abandoned. If they kept farming, they took the cows out of the woods. It was realized that these cows aren't getting good graze out in the woods, so cows came off the hills. Then what happened? Succession. And what colonized those hillsides? A sea of prickly ash and hazelnut and sumac and aspen clones popping in here and there. Great, in other words, really dense, thick as the hair on a dog's back. Grouse habitat. So the grouse flourished. And other species associated with young forests did as well. But how long does grouse habitat last? This is something that I impress upon landowners over and over again, because I frequently hear this. I'll visit their forest, I'll visit their farm, and we'll start to talking about grouse, and they'll say, we gotta kill these damn coyotes. I got this patch of brush up the head of the valley. 20 years ago, we used to slay the grouse up there. They were drumming in there, we had grouse all over. They're not there anymore, that brush is still there. Must be coyotes, must be owls, must be turkeys, must be something else. And I'll say, so 20 years ago you had grouse, that's no longer grouse habitat. What do you mean? I haven't done anything. It's still, look at it, it's right there. I said, well, let's go look at it. And we walk out, and it's not brush, it's pole-sized timber. This is a great time of year to get a good feel what's going on in our forests. Drive up and down these valleys. Without the leaves, you can see right up to the ridge. Right? I do this all the time. And what do you see? If you were to close your eyes, which you shouldn't do while you're driving, but play with me. Close your eyes, stop and look. 9 times out of 10, when you stop, you're going to see a pole-sized stand of timber. Okay? Probably some evidence of logging, some stumps and whatnot. But brush is not common in this landscape anymore. Okay? In a disturbed area, you'll start to see young forest adapted species like ruffed grouse utilizing the stand in about 5 years. So if you clear cut a site, or the wind blows it down, or you take the cows out of the woods, in about 5 years it's getting dense enough, brushy enough for grouse. By year 20, use by those species is declining. So you've got this window, right? That succession pushes that forest through. After year 20, it's only going to deteriorate from the viewpoint of ruffed grouse or other young forest species. What's the only way to maintain that cover on the landscape then?
Cut another little patch.
Cut another little patch, disturbance. Okay?
Scott, what would you recommend for like a clear cut size if you wanted? Let's say you had an 80-acre parcel. Would you do like 2-acre clear cuts, 3-acre? What would you recommend as far as?
This is like a planted question. It's the perfect question. Depends on what you're interested in, quite honestly. But again, given that young forest condition is ephemeral, if you had 80 acres, it would be best to break it into compartments, and depending on what species you're talking about and what the proper harvest rotation age is, say it's aspen, so it's got maybe a 45 or 50 year rotation age, you might want to cut 20 acres every 10 years, right? So you're breaking it up. Depends on what size it is and whether or not it's merchantable at that size, etc. But by breaking it into compartments, you increase the interspersion of habitats, and you ensure that there's always some of that young forest present for the birds.
Are you talking clear cutting?
Yes. In the case of aspen, now again, it depends on what forest type you're talking. If, and we'll get into this, if it were oak, clear cutting is not usually what you're shooting for unless you've already got some well-established advanced regeneration, meaning there are little oak seedlings all over the forest floor. Oak needs sunlight, so if you've got lots of big oak trees, you want to get rid of some of that canopy so that those young trees can come in and create the next generation oak forest. So if you've got lots of oak seedlings on the ground floor, clear cutting is sometimes an option, but usually oak regeneration requires more steps. And getting that advanced regeneration, those oak seedlings established, leads you into a shelterwood sequence, a seed tree harvest, something along those lines, where you're taking out some of the canopy, leaving some big trees for seed, until you get that dense carpet of oak seedlings on the forest floor. You said clear cut.
And how does that work?
Shame on you. What's that?
How does that work with terrain?
Terrain in this country is always something to consider, and it leads to debates, because you'll often hear that you shouldn't intensively harvest on steep slopes, right? Because of erosion, you're removing the cover. However, I've heard the viewpoint expressed by some forester buddies that nowhere do you see greater erosion than under a maple basswood canopy, because there's very little understory, right? So in that context, maybe an intensive harvest would actually reduce erosion and increase infiltration over time. But certainly slope is important. Okay.
I have a question. Is it possible, once you've created that habitat that we're looking for, is it possible to maintain that, to lengthen its life rather than just do the 20-20-20? Like pick an area and keep it in that.
It depends on what it is,
Yeah.
and it depends on what your goals as a landowner are. If you've got some economic interests, like I do, I've got 5 kids. If I can make a little money off the trees growing on my farm, I'm going to do that. Once a stand of aspen, stand of oak, whatever, gets past that young forest age, there's a lot of value being added. Those trees are growing. Those are pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters, dollars, right? So from that point of view, it's usually in your best interest to let that oak stand go 80 years with maybe a thinning harvest somewhere in between. So of course during that time you sacrifice the young forest conditions, but maybe you can create them elsewhere. I will say, and I just had a conversation with a DNR forester about this the other day, where you've got brush, prickly ash, sumac, hazelnut, etc. Even if you've got your acres enrolled in MFL, oftentimes that's classified as non-productive, right? But that brush, that prickly ash or whatever, is going to mature. If you can talk about old growth prickly ash, right? Eventually it'll lose that dense understory, it'll start to thin out some elms, bitternuts, whatever, it'll start to poke out through the top. Up north, what they do in alder stands, when alder, you guys know what alder is? It's a shrub, grows densely in wet areas, primarily in central and northern Wisconsin. When alder hits about the age of 20, they'll go in with a Fecon mower or a Terex machine, whatever, and they'll just mulch it. The Ruffed Grouse Society pays a lot of money to support that type of habitat work. It's great woodcock habitat. So they're just regenerating alder. The conversation I had with this DNR forester was essentially, why can't we do the same thing in the Driftless area to perpetually maintain young forest conditions where we currently have brush? And it was actually the forester that brought that up. He said, boy, one of the things we're missing, and you know, the declining grouse is reflective of this, is a lot of young forest habitat. Why let the prickly ash that we have growing in patches here and there along field edges, why let that mature to other forests? Why don't we go in and mow it? The problem is, how much does it cost to hire a contractor to put in a logging road? Or use heavy equipment for anything on your land? A couple $100 an hour probably, right? It's non-commercial work. You're gonna have to pay somebody to get in there with that Fecon mower or whatever. There are grants, there are farm bill programs, WIFLGIP, that will provide cost share assistance, but it's still coming out of your pocketbook. I forget what the original question was, but did that?
Once you have established what you want, is it possible to maintain it? Let's leave the economics out of it and just say it can't be done.
It can be done.
Okay.
It can be done, sure.
All right.
Yeah, all you gotta do is disturb it again.
Okay.
Remember, succession, disturbance. So if the stand's succeeding past where you want it, at any point, you can just disturb it. Disturb it, disturb it. Your friendly neighborhood forester may have a heart attack when he sees you mowing off that beautiful stand of young oak trees, but you're paying taxes. All right, I just wanted to give you an idea what's happened in the Driftless area with respect to our forest cover. Anybody in here around in 1937? And care to admit it? So this is Highway 56, just east of Viola. This is part of one of the study areas where we had those grouse flying around with necklaces. This is River Road, right? So the Kickapoo River is right over here. Dr. Dingis's farm would be right here, if you're familiar with the area. But at any rate, this is an aerial photo. The first flight series flown in this part of the state from 1937. Look at that forest, right? Obvious signs of agriculture. The valleys have been cleared. The ridges have been cleared to some extent to support agriculture. And those wooded hillsides, in some cases, look like parks, right? You can pick out individual trees, right? These vast areas look like, you know, Little House on the Prairie. Laura Ingalls Wilder frolicking amongst a couple big oak trees. Very open. Now take a look at that, 1937 to 2003. Exactly the same landscape. So when I talk to landowners about the fact that that patch of brush up in their valley has changed in the last 20 years, they don't sense that because they see it every day. Looks like it did yesterday and last week, so probably looks like it did 20 years ago. Not at all, right? The forest, when the cows came out of the woods, closed in. It was brushy for a while, but about that long. Now it's a mature forest, which if you remember, all those wildlife species, including all those birds I had on my first slide, I didn't point those out, indigo buntings and the like, habitat for those critters is gone, largely gone. Okay? Isn't that dramatic? I'll just show that again. Same old landscape.
And that's still 12 years ago,
Yeah.
2003.
Yeah. So today, where do we have this young forest cover? Where do we have this brush? Well, one of the things we did when I was doing this Ruffed Grouse research is we went out and typed the different forest stands. So we know where the oak stands are, the sawlog-sized sugar maple. And one of our habitat types was ES, early successional forest, brush, right? And in this area, this is Goose Creek up here, Welker Hollow Road, just between Lafarge and Viola. This is where the brush was, okay? And you can see little patches, linear strips, essentially along field edges. The big blocks of forest cover, had no brush, okay? They matured past the point where they were young, vibrant, really successional forests. And you might say, and I forget the percentage, but I think about 9% of that forested landscape was young forest, was brush, which isn't bad. In terms of a healthy forest, you know, you got 10% young forest, different age classes, but when you look at the size of those patches of brush, most of them were less, almost all of them were less than 2 acres in size. Does this sound like the landscape you're familiar with?
That's my property.
The acres you like? Little patches of brush along field edges. And unfortunately, it's not all prickly ash, sumac, and hazelnut. It's, what are we fighting all the time? Multiflora rose. That's multiflora rose. But the grouse love it. They got no, they're not, They're not above using a little exotic species cover. Another thing we, of course, typed when we were doing this research is aspen. In Aspen, we're not northern Wisconsin. We don't have 1,000-acre stretches of aspen. But about 7% of the, I think, 6,000 acres we typed as part of this project was aspen. It's here, it's there. You see it this time of year clearly, the light bark stuff, dotting hills. Small little 1/4 acre to maybe 5-acre clones of aspen. But the thing that was surprising to me, we broke the sapling clone, or the aspen clones we found into sapling size classes, pole size classes, saw timber size classes. 6,000 acres, we found no sapling aspen. It had colonized these areas when the cows came out of the woods. You know, those pastured hillsides, aspen seeds are as small as a pinhead. They need to land on exposed soil to have any chance of surviving. And these former pastures, with the activity of the livestock, perfect. Some seeds blowing, we had these clones initiated, but essentially no aspen's been initiated in this landscape for 25 plus years. It's all older. And if you know anything about aspen, what happens to aspen if you don't cut it?
It tips over.
It falls over and it's replaced by species like oaks, like maples, that better tolerate shade. Clear-cutting aspen is like giving it a haircut. Right? It looks better, it comes back. Nice and young, we'll look at that in a bit. So we have aspen. And what that gives us is potential to produce this missing young forest component. Another habitat type, and this is astounding to me, but another habitat type that we defined was OM, oak converting to maple. The position that these different tree species occupy on that successional continuum from the young brushy forest to the climax forest is determined by how well they can grow in shade, their shade tolerance. The pioneer species like aspen need full sunlight, right? But as they grow up and fill the canopy, they can't grow in their own shade. Something more shade tolerant, like maybe oak or ash or black cherry comes in. And they grow and they cast a dense shade until they can't grow in the understory either. So they're replaced by something more shade tolerant until you get to the most shade tolerant tree in our neighborhood. What's that?
Maple.
Sugar maple. Okay? So what we defined here were oak stands that had large oak trees in the canopy, but had an understory of maple or other mesic species like ironwood is a common inclusion around here. 30-some% of all the forested acres were oak converting to maple, meaning, in essence, the oak's being lost. Without some intervention, that oak's, in another century, not going to be present on these sites. It's all going to be sugar maple. My family makes maple syrup. I love maple, but I do not want a farm that's 100% maple. That's not a healthy forest by my definition. Okay, so this is concerning. This photograph I took somewhere out in this landscape. Beautiful, high-dollar red oak tree, dropping yummy little nutritious acorns on the ground for squirrels and turkeys and deer and flying squirrels and mice. A lot of wildlife value in that tree. 3 aspens sticking up there indicating a history of disturbance. This is all sugar maple. Okay, pretty typical around here. That sugar, I don't mean to cast it in a negative way. Those sugar maples are nice trees. Go about their business. They're not evil. But again, this is natural succession in the absence of the disturbance that those oak forests need to perpetuate themselves. Okay. I want to talk about oak for a minute. By training, I'm a wildlife biologist. And I would say that one of the most serious threats to the diversity of our wildlife community is that transition, that mesification of our forests, the transition from oak to maple. This is FIA data, Forest Inventory and Analysis. It's a long-term monitoring data set of our forest composition for oak statewide in Wisconsin. So it's oak broken down by age class, 0 to 5 years, on and on and on, and by ownership. Blue is private. Who owns some private forest land? You folks are critically important, right? This is privately held, and we've got county land, state land, federal land. Who owns almost all the oak forests in Wisconsin? You and I, private landowners. You see a few things from this graph. First, if the human population in southwest Wisconsin had this type of age well, I shouldn't say it probably does. But if any human population had this type of age distribution, what would you say? It's going to crash, right?
Bubble.
As these older individuals fade from the scene, there's nobody to replace them. Same thing here. Our oak forests are not regenerating themselves, right? Where did these oaks come from? You look at the age classes here. 60 years ago, 80 years ago, 100 years ago. That's when Grandpa Harold Walter was burning that hillside pasture.
The timber companies came through 100 years ago.
The bowling pin factory, is it?
No, the big timber companies,
Yeah.
they came through and just clear cut Wisconsin.
Northern Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, from
There's-
where we live up by Toma, where the railroads,
Okay.
everything north of there.
Yeah.
What were they called? The Goodyear Timber Mills or whatever.
Yeah. And a lot of logging took place around here as well.
Used a lot of ties.
Mhm. Bottom line here, though, is we're losing our oak forests. They're being replaced by maple. Because we've forgotten, it seems, succession, disturbance. The two are important. Succession, nature's taking care of succession. We're not, at least on an appropriate scale, utilizing disturbance to make sure that oak perpetuates itself. I live in fear of passing our farm on to my kids without all the things that made me fall in love with it. Sitting under an oak tree, listening to the nuts fall, chasing squirrels, listening to turkeys gobble, felling a hickory tree and seeing a flying squirrel come out of it. That's all tied into this community
And that's because people aren't harvesting their wood?
in the right way. There's certainly a lot of timber harvesting going on around here. Okay.
So Scott,
Yep.
one of the challenges might be though that deer, 80 years ago, you know, when we were cutting down trees, there wasn't as many deer. You have 50 deer per acre, they'll mow off all these little oak seedlings, right? So you have all these oak seed trees. And I did a cut where they cut the oaks and all these little oaks came up and they're all mowed off.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
I no longer work for the DNR, so I can say something I couldn't last year. We have too many deer. From a forest management standpoint, it's a huge issue.
sure.
The tree species that deer favor, white pine, red oak, they're tough to regenerate in areas with abundant deer. A story from our farm, 1992, when I was just getting real active in managing our farm, we planted 1,500 red oaks in this old ridgetop field. And then I wasn't living there at the time, I was living down near Madison going to school. Kind of did what you're not supposed to do when you plant trees, we just forgot them. We figured nature will take care of it. The blackberries spilled into that planting from the corner of the field. And I thought, oh, those are going to choke out the oak trees, they're not going to live. Exactly the opposite happened. In areas where the blackberries hadn't reached, the deer, I've still got oak trees from 1992 that are this tall. They nip the buds every winter. But where the blackberries came in really thick, the deer wouldn't walk. I've got oak trees this big around. Okay? So yeah, Adrian's exactly right. Deer can be a big problem. We do a lot of funding. The Ruffed Grouse Society, as with when I was with the DNR. And when we have people apply for money to establish oaks, often they include $2 a tree for tree shelters or fencing, deer-proof fencing to fence off a 10-acre planting. It's incredibly expensive. But they'll tell you right in the proposal, if you want oaks, it's the only way to get them above the deer. So It's a good point. It's a big issue. So, as was just mentioned, what's going on with our aspen? Why are they all old? What's going on with our oak? Why are they all old? Why are they being replaced by sugar maple? Well, a lack of disturbance. Again, succession without appropriate disturbance. I'm not saying we're not cutting trees around here, but I'm saying we're not often cutting trees in the way we need to favor the species we want to favor. Okay? In northern Wisconsin, the reason we still have healthy grouse and other young forest wildlife populations, we've got an active pulpwood market, right? The paper mills up there and others, biomass, the cardboard plate, tar paper, all these markets for pulpwood, chips, etc., leads to regeneration harvest for aspen. So, boom, you get these young forests constantly springing up on the landscape, setting back succession. In our neck of the woods, markets are primarily driven by hardwoods. The harvests tend to be selective, right? You go into a maple stand, northern hardwood stand, you take this nice tree, this nice tree. You don't open the canopy up enough to let the sunlight in, okay? So that oftentimes just hastens succession. So in northern Wisconsin, we're constantly moving things back to younger successional stages. Around here, oftentimes harvest occurs, but it keeps things where they are or even hastens the development of a maple basswood forest. So very different systems. Okay? And of course, this is a huge issue. Some audiences, if I were to say clear cut, I'd get jeered, I'd get booed, I'd have things thrown at me, right? And this is, when I was teaching, I used to teach a course on environmental ethics. And I always, can I preach for a minute?
Yes.
I would always begin by talking about one of Plato's dialogues. Plato and Aristotle used to talk about ethics and morality and truth. But they disagreed on whether or not truth was universally shared or whether or not truth was relative to the individual's background, right? Relativism versus universalism, if you remember, if you ever read it. It's really cool stuff to read. But I would always tell my students, approach every environmental issue we talk about as a relativist. Because if you are convinced that what you believe should be shared by everybody, we're not going to have anything but fisticuffs in class. You have to understand the way other folks believe and why they make the decision to manage a certain way or not manage. And we're not going to make progress. Why did I say that? Because oftentimes when you're talking to the public, you have folks that are passionate but may not have a full understanding of the issue they're passionate about, right? You have individuals who took a history class where they talked about the clear cut that swept across northern Wisconsin in the late 1800s. No respect to silviculture, forest management. They were going to make a buck. There was a tree stand and they were going to cut it. That had some bad negative impacts on northern Wisconsin and other areas. So in their mind, clear cut equals bad. So when you try to talk about the use of intensive timber harvests like clear cut, shelterwood cuts, etc., to regenerate oak, regenerate aspen, all I hear is clear cut and you're evil and I hate you. They've got this universalist approach when it comes to forest management. They believe what they believe and damn it, you better too. Okay? Not that we're all not like that. I've got some pretty firmly held beliefs. But again, beliefs should be based on understanding before you start to push for one thing or another. Now, when you look at those photos, warm fuzzies, who at this point in the talk is getting warm fuzzies by looking at those photos? Thank you. One person. Just one person. Okay. If these types of harvests are done appropriately, they increase diversity, structural diversity, species diversity, wildlife diversity on the landscape. Not saying all intensive harvests are good. You can't just go out with a chainsaw, I'm going to cut this and this and this. But if prescribed by a forester, they're going to do good things. Okay? And again, it's an emotional issue. this is something I was just made aware of last week. This Wild Virginia group, they advocate for healthy forests, which we all agree with, right? So they try to keep public lands, public forest lands from being sold off. They try to keep oil and mineral interests from mining in forests. They try to keep forests from being fragmented, from being developed. All good things. But on their website, you see they've got, don't let them destroy our forests. When they list, they've got this list of things that are threatening their forests. One of the threats to the health of their forests is wildlife management. Because forest wildlife management is using timber harvest to result in desired wildlife habitat. Indicating to me that this is a group of folks, passionate as they are, and they should be our allies, right? There's a lot of threats to the health of our natural communities. We should be sitting arm in arm trying to keep bad things from happening, but we fragment given our different beliefs. But it became clear to me when I was reading this manifesto on their website that they just don't like to see trees cut. And as an ecologist, that flies in the face of everything I have learned about what produces healthy forests. Leopold, what was, you guys know Aldo Leopold, right? One of his greatest quotes, and there are many, says something along the lines, and I'm not going to get this right, but I'll paraphrase. The greatest tool in conservation is not the pen, but the axe. Recognizing that to produce diverse and abundant wildlife communities, we've got to manage our timber resources.
Well,
But anyway.
We've cut out all the natural way a forest can regenerate by stopping forest fires, stopping disease, homesteading.
Getting rid of beavers.
Yeah, getting rid of beavers, you know, yeah.
Well, you want to talk beavers?
I love beavers.
Most of your municipalities have ordinances against having outdoor wood burners or those type of things within cities, and so therefore there's less people that are harvesting wood. I mean, just your farmers are generally the ones doing it now that live on the land. So,
Lots of things keeping us from cutting the trees, but it's this ethic, this philosophy that's developed amongst folks, you know, very good intentioned, but perhaps not informed about why wildlife management wants to cut that stand of aspen trees or thin that oak stand or whatever. I'm going to deviate and talk about beavers for 12 seconds.
Yay!
So as a wildlife guy, I love beavers. Dams, ponds, great wildlife habitat, ducks, frogs, blah, 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 right? But in this country, given the beautiful, wonderful trout fishing opportunities that are afforded us, managing for trout has sort of preempted beavers on the landscape. So I would always argue with friends on the fish side of the equation about beavers. I would say, and tongue-in-cheek, I would tell them that I'm going to start my own conservation organization, which you all can join, called Beaver Unlimited, with the motto, dedicated to the eradication of brook trout from all potential beaver habitat. Edit that out, please. All right, so main point here, if you understand now the role that intensive timber harvest can play and their necessary role in maintaining diverse forest communities, you understand the threat that inaction, right, poses. And that inaction is often driven simply by a lack of understanding of basic forest dynamics. Okay? Now let's say we want to do something. There's another problem afoot in our lovely Driftless area. In northern Wisconsin, years ago maybe I would have gotten a job, perhaps I would have taken a job as a biologist on the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. 1.8 million acres. I can write a plan, implement it on 1.8 million acres. Maybe that plan calls for a nice balance of climax forest communities, young forest, regenerating oak stands, etc., etc. In our area, it's a little tougher to do things on a meaningful scale. Why? Let's look at the plat map.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay? That's the challenge. That's who you have to deal with. All good people. These are my neighbors down by Sylvan. Right? All good people, but with different beliefs, different ethics, different willingness to engage in active forest management, different levels of understanding, different goals, different motivations. Trophy bucks. Take half the people in that landscape, they shoot a 12-pointer in the fall, they're doing a great job. End of story. Don't want to hear about garlic mustard. Don't tell me about loss of oak. That 12-pointer tells me I'm doing what I need to do. I may be exaggerating, but only a bit. So if we want to make a meaningful change in terms of how forests are managed in our area, we've got to do this. We've got to talk about what the issues are. We've got to talk about what opportunities there are to move toward solutions. Okay?
How important are corridors to species like woodcock and grouse instead of divided up little tiny itty bitty parcels, but a nice corridor?
That's an excellent question. Woodcock are migratory, so for them the answer is a little bit different, but for ruffed grouse, if you remember that slide I showed with all the little patches of brush, the females moving, for a female grouse to move from the patch of brush up on Ben's farm over the ridge to a patch of brush on mine, it might as well be walking through a desert. And grouse usually move across the landscape by walking. A grouse that flies is a grouse that dies, is the same, but they might as well be walking through a desert. Okay, so providing some young forest cover in between those patches would certainly be beneficial, a corridor, in other words.
Because that leaves them wide open for predators.
All right, so remember, I mean, this is fundamentally what folks have to come to understand in order to want to do something that promotes healthy forest communities on their landscape. Without this, you don't have this, right? It's that simple. The reason our grouse have declined, the reason our whippoorwills potentially have declined, the reason all these young forest adapted species have declined, the habitat they need is declined because of a lack of active management. Okay? So that disturbance is important. Now I'm going to talk about, so you need to convince people that these young forests are important. Young trees need hugs too, right? One of my favorite sayings. People gravitate toward forests because they're beautiful. Those photos I showed of the Driftless Area, those areas, just beautiful. I want to spend the weekend out in the woods. But people tend to gravitate, for some reason, to big trees. As a kid that grew up rabbit hunting, if I don't come out of the woods bleeding, I didn't have a good day. I like young forests. I like dense young brush. I like older forests too, but we're tipping a little too much that way. But to convince people that there are reasons why they should fire up that chainsaw, talk to a forester, talk to a logger. Lots of neat research showing the value of intensive timber harvest. 42 species. SGCN is species of greatest conservation need. Species that are declining are at low levels. 42 species that are listed by states in the Midwest and eastern part of the United States are species that require young forest habitats, brush. Okay? And if you look at this is data, I think that, if I remember, it comes out of Missouri. On the x-axis here, we've got the number of years post-logging. And these were clear cuts, or shelterwood harvests. They were monitoring the bird community. You look what happens. Things like juncos, song sparrows, indigo buntings, towhees, white-throated sparrows. You get 15 years post-harvest, they're already declining. Grouse would soon follow. All these young forest species would follow. The only way to maintain them is to cut more. Cut over here, cut over there. And when I say cut more, I'm not saying, yeah, there's some trees, let's fire it up, let's take them out. cut according to a forester's prescription. Cut according to what's out there and what's needed to be done to regenerate that stand or produce the type stand that you're looking for. So a lot of species need these young forests, okay? When I was first getting into the wildlife field as a grad student back in the early 90s, now, holy cow, there was this dichotomy. Wildlife biologists would argue about the value of edge species. You ever heard that term, edge species? Like ruffed grouse were an edge species. Indigo buntings, an edge species, brush adapted species. And what they called forest interior songbirds. Birds that when folks went out in the spring and did their bird surveys, only showed up where there were large blocks of mature forest. The interpretation was those birds, like pileated woodpeckers, ovenbirds, things like that, those birds need large untouched blocks of forest. But we only knew about them during the breeding season, because that's when you can hear the males singing. The males tended to be associated with those older forests, large blocks of older forests. So they would say, don't cut trees. You'll reduce habitat, usable habitat for ovenbirds. These folks would say, cut trees. If you want to save indigo buntings and ruffed grouse, eastern towhees, on and on. And it was a dichotomy, a little bit of a battle that waged within the wildlife community. New research, though, has really shed some light on this issue. It turns out that any songbird, including these birds we thought were only associated with large blocks of untouched forest, the young birds seek out and utilize brush. So an ovenbird chick hatches from the nest, it's fed worms, fed, hops out. If it doesn't get into some protective cover before it becomes an effective, efficient flyer, it's going to get picked off. So what this data, this is a really messy graph, but here are, 8 or 10 species of interior songbirds during the breeding season. They're connected with large blocks of mature forest. The young birds, the juvenile birds of all these species, are found most often in clear cuts or small wildlife openings than they are in mature forest. Okay? So it's not as simple as saying grouse need brush, other birds need big trees. Even birds we thought were only associated with large mature forests produce young that need dense brush as well. Okay? And again, that's what's being lost on the landscape.
To add to that, Scott, I believe we've had a talk here that talked about songbirds in mature forests and how they actually are attracted to the oak trees. Oh, sorry.
Bingo! Beautiful, see? Sadie's talking about this study right here, which was done where? Here. Kickapoo Valley Reserve. Right? Biologists went out and they stood with binoculars in the woods, Anna Pigeon and Dave Ladenoff, some of their students, and they watched these birds feeding, as these migrating songbirds feeding up in the canopy. They recorded what trees they fed on, how often they were able to glean a food item, right? So how efficiently they were feeding. And what species were these birds concentrating on? Even though there's ash and hickory and maple and elm and oak out there, northern red oak and white oak. The oaks and everything else. And they've put forth a hypothesis that it has to do with the structure of the oak leaves. Relatively short petioles and broad leaves allow these birds to feed very effectively. So what happens if we lose oaks? Well, Anna and Dave and those guys summed it up pretty well. And again, this is research conducted right here on the Kickapoo Valley Reserve. Sugar maple saplings currently form a nearly continuous layer in the understory. Mesification, oak forest converting to maple. And there is very low recruitment of shade-intolerant and moderately shade-tolerant species. Aspen, oak, the things that require sun. Suggesting a future shift towards dominance by shade-tolerant species, sugar maple and basswood. Our results suggest the current trajectory of forest succession may result in future conditions that provide lower quality foraging for migratory songbirds during spring migration. These are migrating birds that weigh less than your pinky. They need food, energy-rich food, they need it fast, they need lots of it. And this change that's happening to our forests is going to reduce their ability to tank up during migration. Okay? All right. Another interesting study that came out earlier this fall. When these birds are migrating, this is a researcher out at the University of Maine, I think. When these birds are migrating, they've got to tank up, they've got to find abundant food resources, but they don't want to die. So they've got to select habitats where they can get a lot of food, but where they're fairly safe from hawks, owls, etc., etc., etc. What do you think those habitats are? Brush. Young forests. Okay? Think about all this stuff. So these young forests have value from a foraging sense, from an anti-predation sense for songbirds. But think about all these data, all this information. The next time you're driving, you look up the hillside and see nothing but 8-inch sugar maples. Okay? To us, they're beautiful. Like I say, I like sugar maples. But in terms of that healthy community we're trying to support, there's something bad going on. So it's not just species diversity. When I say oak, when I say aspen, it's not just that species and the inherent value like acorns, etc., that it presents a wildlife community. It's also structure. Okay? This regenerating aspen stand is very different than this climax maple forest. A hands-off approach which many people inherently gravitate toward. Folks buy 60 acres of land out here in Richland County, Vernon County. It's just beautiful. Come out here for the weekend, look out the picture window. I just love my woods. I'm glad you do, but unless you do something to your woods, it's not going to be healthy, as Scott Walter defines it anyway. Okay? But another part about parcelization, I showed that plat map and all the landowners. If you own 10 acres of land, you really want to clear cut it? If you own 500, yeah, go cut that 40. That makes sense to me. I love those oaks. Yeah, forester, go out, shelter with it to death. I got the rest. Smaller and smaller land holdings are less likely to be actively managed, right? It's a problem. And then you start getting into policy. All right, what kind of zoning ordinances can we employ? Make sure we don't break this land up to the point where we're handcuffed in terms of management, okay? So active management's important. Shouldn't have talked about beavers now, I'm What can we do in today's landscape? If you're a landowner, what can you do to create some of this young forest habitat? The nice thing is, many of the things you can do are things you should do just to produce healthy forests and to produce maximize economic gains. Timber stand improvements, TSI. Who's done this type of work in their woods? Have your forester go through and mark what should be taken out, which is usually ironwood and some other stuff. Right? This is a stand. This is part of my Ruffed Grouse study area. The landowner just went through and did a TSI. Look at this. You may look at this and say, oh, brushy. Okay? I look at that and say, oh, it's beautiful. I'm going in there in the spring. The birds are going to be nuts. I'm sorry, it's already 8 o'clock. We're not too much left, but stuff keeps popping in here. To show you the value of this, I am constantly amazed on my farm, which I actively manage, according to the plan, amazed at the response I get by the wildlife community when I do things like this. We got an outdoor furnace like you were talking, we burn wood. What I've taken to doing, instead of going after that dead elm and that broken top hickory, I go out and I clear cut little patches that I then underplant with high bush cranberry, hazelnut, wildlife shrubs. Little patches, maybe twice the size of this room every winter, right? 2 years after I had done that, this was just last spring, year ago, last spring, whatever, it was a couple years after I had cleared this patch, I stood and counted 7 male chestnut-sided warblers, flitting around all these little shrubs. I hadn't seen a chestnut-sided warbler in that valley in, I don't know if I ever had. Boom, habitats are there. Okay? And it's all because there's brush. Regenerate aspen. There's another little story here. So when I was studying grouse, I was working with a landowner, this is down by Gotha. And I'd go out and I'd follow these grouse, my students would follow the grouse every day. And I was in there one day, I noticed a new logging road. And I said, hey Linda, I see you had a dozer in here, you're gonna do some logging? And she said, yeah, I got some maple trees up there they're gonna cut out. I said, look, that logging road goes right by this little patch of aspen. See if they'll take that out. Oh, and I made the mistake of saying, see if they'll clear cut that for it. Oh no, I don't want to do anything bad to my land. But I talked her through it. I said, no, I shouldn't have said clear cut, Linda. It's regeneration harvest. Unless you clear cut this, unless you regenerate this, you're going to lose aspen, you're going to sacrifice diversity, etc. And she said, oh, okay, we'll try it. 4 or 5 years later, she came back and told me that's the best thing she'd ever done as a landowner. That's what this stand looked like. It was cut in January. I took this picture in May, June, something like that. By the end of the summer, that's what it looked like. 8, 10 foot tall aspen seedlings, dense. And she said, just what I was referring to, she said the birds in there, Scott, you wouldn't believe. I said, yeah. So there's potential. Just flip back. Look at all those little patches of aspen. The problem is what? There's very little market for aspen around here. I have given aspen to loggers and they haven't cut it. Okay? Difficult to unload it at times. All right.
Use it for pulp up north.
Oak regeneration. We don't have time to go into this in detail, but oak is tricky. You can't just cut trees and cut big oak trees and have little oak trees come in. There's a sequence you may have to engage in to get the young oak trees established. You have to fight against competing vegetation. And it may be a decade-long process with many little interventions to get those baby oak trees well established. There are deer to deal with. So talk to a forester. If you've got big oak trees and you want your grandkids to see big oak trees on that same site, talk to a forester. This type of stuff, meeting and talking about the impacts of what we do or don't do in our forested areas is really important. So, we go out, we give workshops, we talk to people, and it's great. Sharing information, sharing stories is wonderful as part of the educational process, but there are a couple things. One, you tend to see the same people. If I hold a workshop on young forest management in Richland County this year, another one next year, you see the same people. It's very hard to engage the unengaged, to interest the uninterested, right? But the unengaged folks own most of the private land out there. Okay, the folks that are interested in doing good work, God bless you, but talk to your neighbors, okay? But outreach is important. If you learn something tonight, talk to your neighbors about it. Share the good news. Provide landowners tools, assistance, financial support. A lot of these issues can be addressed at higher levels through policy development. One of the things that, when I was with the DNR, I worked on was the development of Dulce, the Driftless Area. I don't know if you heard about this, but it dumped a pile of federal dollars through the Farm Bill to the tune of $15 million right into the Driftless Area, in part to regenerate oak. So there was a lot of good work done policy-wise. Okay? Get involved.
Some of that money.
You guys, it's still there.
Sign us up.
If you're interested, go talk to your local NRCS. They administer that program. Your county NRCS person. How many of you have engaged in My Wisconsin Woods? Driftless Forestry Network, DFN. It's one conduit to a wealth of information about active forest management. And these folks have done a really good job. A woman named Tricia Canute, who's a social scientist now with the DNR, a really good job at trying to identify through surveys, etc., and address the barriers to engagement. Why aren't landowners managing their forests? And the explanations are interesting. A lot of it, again, has to do with lack of understanding and ethics that have evolved that don't embrace things like clear cuts. Right? All right. One of the things I'm really promoting and trying to get off the ground is something called a forest without fences concept. I've actually got a meeting Friday with a couple folks on this. But the idea is to get neighbors to work together. So here's the Kickapoo Valley. Here's all these sub-watersheds like Elk Creek, right? Camp Creek, Goose Creek, Weister Creek, etc., etc., etc. What if you could bring all those landowners together, or a big swack of them? Roast a pig, have a raffle, drink a beer, share stories, and then start talking about forest management. Those landowners, those neighbors are going to have an interest in big bucks, in what happened to ruffed grouse, in turkeys, in making money from their woods. So you can tell them how to get there through active management, right? So I'm going to wrap up here pretty quick, but the idea, and this is a naive, silly idea that is swelling in my brain, is to really emphasize the community approach to conservation. To emphasize the fact that neighbors share a responsibility, goes right across the line fence to properly manage their woodlands. Okay? In fact, I'm so naive that when I think about this forest without fences concept, I think back to my grandparents' day. Neighbors shared work. They threshed grain together. And they cut wood together. If there was an issue, they dealt with it together. Today's driftless landscape's far different than the one my dad grew up in. Because you don't have farm families up and down every creek and ridge spending time together. You've got a mixture of family farmers and absentee landowners and recreational landowners, and it's the community feel somehow been lost. But my naive idea is, instead of threshing grain, let's get together and talk about forest management. That oak stand on my land stretches across the line fence onto yours. What are we going to do? You and I, neighbors. Okay. You got some trees to plant? Hey, I got a tree spade. Let's go to town. All right, so all these forest types are important. We want them all in the landscape. Regenerating young forests, floodplain forests, climax maple basswood forests, a regenerating oak forest that's been through a shelterwood sequence. They're all important. Diversity on the landscape is what we're talking about. But remember, nature is pointing everything here. The only way we get here or here is if we intervene. Because remember, lots of critters, including grouse, etc., need these. So they're kind of in our hands. All right, I think we'll leave it there. Yep.
So, we have a lot of state parks, we have national park system in Wisconsin, uninterrupted large tracts of land. Have any of these practices been implemented in those areas?
I may have made it seem like public land management was awful easy when I talked about getting a job up on the national forest. It's challenging to do the right thing ecologically on public lands often too, because of the public, right? Public input processes, lawsuits, all these things can handcuff proper management on our public lands. The answer though is yes, right? It happens, but it's difficult, right?
I know there was some clear cutting that was taking place down at Governor Dodge State Park.
Forest restoration.
Yeah.
Regeneration.
Thank you, regeneration. Beaver implementation. But I'm thinking of a lot of other areas that I see just huge stands of mature trees and nothing else.
Mhm.
Good
So-
place to start.
Yeah, I mean, whoever owns that land, whoever's managing that land, if it's your neighbor, have a chat with them. And I'm not saying big trees need to be cut. Like I said, we make syrup, I've got stands of maple that will, as long as I'm alive, are always gonna be maple. But succession would take everything else and turn it into a maple forest as well. So that's where I'm focusing my management, yep.
I got a couple questions for you. I just did a clear cut,
Forest regeneration.
about 5 acres of aspen, and it came back just terrific from the root system,
Mm-hmm.
and really thick. And now I got a lot of, well, not a lot, but there is cottonwood, and cottonwood and poplar are kind of related, right?
Yes, they are.
Now, do rough grouse like cottonwood?
Nope.
Get rid of them.
This must be a moisture site, Valley?
It seemed to be in the valley and up on the hill, there's a few of them too.
Cottonwood's up there too.
Yeah.
No, cottonwood does not coppice sprout, so you cut a cottonwood tree, it might stump sprout a bit, but you're not gonna get this dense young
Okay,
stand like you do with aspen. It's very different.
good. Then I got that prickly ash. I was thinking of spraying it, but it sounds like maybe I shouldn't, huh?
Well, see, this is that personal ethic.
Yeah.
I remember, in fact, I was working on an article for the Ruffed Grouse Society magazine today, and in it I was reflecting on this. So I'm very engaged in actively managing my land, and I have been for a couple decades, few decades now, right? So over the course of those management efforts, I've gotten feedback from people I care about and who are very interested in that farm. One was my dad. He would see what I was doing out in the woods to promote brush. And he would say, you gotta get some cows out there, that brush is gonna take over. You gotta get rid of that brush. Because his background, he was a farm kid, right? You don't want brush out there with that. My father-in-law told me the same thing a couple weeks ago. He was out visiting, my mother and father-in-law. He looked down and he said, you know, put up fence, you could get a bunch of sheep on those hills. It'd be beautiful, look just like a park. And I was like, my brother has always told me that the pre-settlement forest around here was maple basswood. You should not be cutting trees. Everything should be maple basswood. That's what he thinks. He's not paying the taxes, so I told him to take up paying. I did a very intensive timber stand improvement right along the township road. A number of neighbors told me I was ruining the hills. Looks like hell, what the heck are you doing up there? God, it's junk, you knocked all those nice trees down. You're not paying taxes. Go to the talk at the KVR, we'll explain it.
Yeah, I got partridge in
Yeah, we do.
5 miles down the road, it takes people that ain't got partridge.
Yep, that's right.
How are woodcock establishing around here? So if you do these aspen clear cuts and that, will they gravitate into these areas?
Yeah, we have more woodcock than generally people believe. But woodcock eat what? Little wildlife was. Predominantly earthworms, right? So they're a moist soil species. So they'll utilize the cover that might be up on the hillsides and up on the ridge. But they're generally going to be in the creek bottoms, in the willows, in the prickly ash thickets, etc., in the dogwood thickets, feeding on earthworms. So habitat that can be perpetuated, dense young habitat that can be perpetuated on moist soils is going to benefit woodcock. Who spends time in the spring watching the sky dance? If you haven't, you have to do it. You know what I'm talking about? The breeding flight of the male woodcock?
Never seen it.
Oh my Lord, this spring, go out right at dusk, and starting in early April, go out in dusk and listen, I'll do my woodcock, listen for this. May, may, yep, right, listen for that. Sounds kind of like a nighthawk, but
Yeah.
listen for that, and then move toward it. And these males will sit in an open area, and they'll do this little peep call, and then every few minutes they'll take off, and they'll vocalize, tweet, 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 tweet. And they've got scalloped flight feathers, so the wind going through them twitters, so it's just neat. And they spiral so high in the sky you can't see them, and then they come just zipping back down right to where they landed. So what you can do, I'm way over time, what you can do is sneak in, and when they take off, sneak in even closer, and just sit quietly. Sometimes you'll kind of scare them and they'll land a little further away, but oftentimes they'll come right back down in front of you. Last spring, my daughter Connie and I were in a wet area, so I was actually crawling and she was on my back. And every time that bird would take off, we'd crawl a little bit closer. At one point, he came down and landed 4 inches in front of my face. And my daughter on my back was just like, and this bird's, really, really neat. A neat experience for a kid. And for her dad, I was soaking wet.
And the series is going to take a break in January. We do have our Winter Festival on January 9th, and we will have a number of wildlife ecology talks at that, so January 9th for that. And then we'll pick back up in February. February 10th, we'll have a talk on snowy owls.
Oh,
So
good.
we'll come back for that. Thank you.
Thank you.